Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks for having me.
You brought receipts.
Just some demonstratives. I also brought a couple gifts.
Oh wow!
So here is your very own pocket constitution.
Oh my God!
And I could only get two. So you and Jeremy Danny have got to fight for that one, or maybe it can be the official what Bitcoin did.
Presumably you're given one when you're born here, aren't you? So you probably have one, Jeremy.
That's right. I actually left mine at the office, so I'm gonna use that today.
This is really very fucking cool.
So yeah, it's got everything in there. It's got the Declaration of Independence. It's got some state Bill of Rights in there. Yeah.
The entire framework of the United States legislation.
That's right.
It's in this little book.
That's right. It's funny because you're gonna think I'm a really big nerd, but I sent it with my son, my 6-year-old son, for show and tell on Memorial Day, because it was like, oh, bring something that's like patriotic or whatever, and I'm like, I don't have like little flags or like toy soldiers or anything like that.
A gun,
but don't have one of those ATF. If you're listening, I don't have any of those.
Straight out of Compton on vinyl.
Right. So I sent him with the pocket constitution because this is what our soldiers died fighting for. The ideas in this book. And he was laughing because then I had a treatise, from law school that explains all of it. And it's like 1,000+ pages and it's 5 times as, wide. And he's like, wait a second. Everything in this little book is the Constitution. Then what's all the extra words over there? It's like, well, that's what everybody's fighting over.
I'll tell you something really interesting is that back when you're at school, when you're a kid and you're trying to figure out what you want to be or what you want to do in life, at certain points in your education, I don't know if it's the same in the US, but we have options. So when you're about 12, you have a couple of options. One might be choosing between, say, geography and history, or one of them and maybe additional language. You just get these little options.
Right.
And then you do your GCSEs.
Electives.
Yeah. And you do your GCSEs and then you get a couple more options. You do double science, triple science, and whatever. A-levels, you get to pick 4 subjects.
Okay.
I picked economics, surprisingly. I did economics, classical civilization, and geography. And then when you do your degree, you pick 1 subject.
Right.
But one of the really interesting things is it's like this journey you have to go on. You have to pick these things. And so you just pick something.
Right.
Might be interested in it. But I only found when I became an adult that I started to realize the things I wanted to learn about. And if I could pick something now, I'd love to go and study American history. I'm absolutely fascinated by it. And that's one of the reasons I want to make this show with you is that I want to understand more about the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And I just think there's so much, I've got so much interest in the history of the people and the debates they had to establish what the United States was and is now.
Yeah.
And I know very little about it. And as I ask you, I might ask some dumb questions or ask them in really dumb ways, but I'm really interested in it because people do care. I mean, we have the Magna Carta in the UK, but no one really
which was a foundational document for our Constitution as well. I mean, it was.
But we don't refer to it. We don't talk. We don't have protests and say this is against what's in the Magna Carta. Nobody even knows what the fuck's in it. I mean, some people do. Apparently, there's a right to have guns in it, I think, or something. But anyway, I don't really know. So I am really interested in it because just so people know, we're going to be talking about Bitcoin's legal tender and how that fits into this. So. A little education from you today, please, sir.
Well, I'll set the record straight. I'm not a professor. I'm not a constitutional law scholar. I'm a practicing appellate attorney.
What does that mean?
So appellate attorneys, basically, in layman's terms, we don't go to trial. We don't. Occasionally, I will show up at trial if we know there's going to be an appeal at some point. But we operate in the reviewing courts, the higher courts, and we argue that a judgment or an order should be overturned or upheld, and that's a lot of briefing, a lot of writing, and a little bit of argumentation. And when we argue, it's not to one judge; it's usually to a panel of 3, and it can be up to 9, on the U.S. Supreme Court. So that's what I do, and my firm represents, regular everyday clients, but also big corporations, and we're appellate attorneys are kind of the last of the generalist attorneys. We have to know a little bit about a lot of subjects. So one day I'll be working on, contract law. The next day I'll be working on trust and estates. We do everything from bankruptcy and constitutional law. So we really do kind of cover the waterfront.
A bit like a GP has to do a little bit about everything.
Exactly. And so I think, I've started writing on Bitcoin and legal issues related to Bitcoin. And I want to be clear, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants and those who've come before me, right? Some of my friends, Justin Wales, wrote the law review article on Bitcoin as speech in 2019. So, I'm standing on their shoulders, but what I'm hoping to bring is a little bit of a different perspective, that appellate perspective, having seen, a lot of different areas of the law, and we deal with novel issues in the law, and everything in Bitcoin is novel when it comes to the law. So I'm hoping I can bring, a little bit from here, a little bit from there, and find the right, heuristics and the right analogies to make the correct arguments.
And you're a lawyer who discovered Bitcoin, and this is like a side hobby, how you can support Bitcoin on the legal side. This is you carving an area out for yourself.
Yeah, that's so a little bit about my backstory. I guess my Bitcoin journey is, I came into it as a regular investor, during the pandemic. But then I quickly understood the value proposition of Bitcoin. And then it, grabbed a hold of me and I fell down the rabbit hole. And there were two experiences I had, I think, that really primed me to understand Bitcoin's value was that apolitical, censorship, resistant money. So the first was a personal experience, and the second was in my career as an attorney. So when I was 9, my family lived in Liberia, West Africa.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
What was that like?
It was crazy. Yeah, I'll just put it that way. It was during the ceasefire in their civil war. We thought it was more than a ceasefire. We thought that it had been an armistice, but it turned out it was a ceasefire, and hostilities resumed. My father was a theology professor, seminarian for the Methodist Church. Yeah, my mother is a teacher, and she taught like therapeutic art at the local school. Kids had experienced a lot of trauma during the Civil War, and she was helping them through that.
Amazing.
Yeah, and so we were there around 1996, and everything was just devastated, right? I mean, the entire infrastructure, the political system was devastated. There was like a 6-president power sharing agreement between all the warlords at the time. And so it was, obviously the economy was cratered, and, Liberia had its own currency, the Liberian dollar. Because Liberia is very interesting in that it's not a French colony, even though it's surrounded by, Ivory Coast and Senegal and some of these other French colonies that are on, the common French, CFA franc. So they had their own currency. But, it had cratered, obviously. So I had the experience as a kid of walking around with a fanny pack of, Liberian dollars whenever I wanted to go to the convenience store to like buy something simple, right?
Right.
So I experienced that, hyperinflation firsthand, basically. The other part of it too was that that's what you get when you have a money issued by a state. If the state fails, then your money fails. And then not only do you have to rebuild your country physically, rebuild your populace emotionally, right, and overcome the scars of war, but now you also are destitute as a country, right? So that was the experience of living there. And my parents, look, we were Americans. We were there, from abroad, and, we were lucky. My dad got paid in USD. Somehow there was some banking affiliate that was able to pay USD cash. So we also did have US dollars that were, everybody of course wanted US dollars at the time. But so we just had, a little stockpile of cash because that's how my dad would get paid. And so when hostilities resumed, then we had to evacuate. And
do you remember that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was 9. I remember all of it.
Was it chaotic?
It was extraordinarily chaotic because it was one warlord, Charles Taylor, who then became the president and then was deposed and tried for war crimes. He came in from the country and with tanks and everything in the middle of the night. We were locked down. We lived on a compound, right? Like big, thick walls, barbed wire, guards that we trusted, with some of the other missionaries and also local pastors. But we had to make it to the embassy to get out because, again, we were lucky. We won the cosmic lottery and were born into the country with the reserve currency and the strongest military in the world at that time that could project its military power and send Marines to send out their expats.
And were you smuggled to an airport and onto a plane?
Yeah, so we had to make a run for it without any, there were like 3 Marines in the country or something. So we had to make a run for it without any protection. And not at gunpoint, at the point of a rocket-propelled grenade, my family was forced out of our car and everything looted and taken from us. So all the cash that my family had on hand, clothes, the family cat, right?
They took the cat.
Took the cat.
Motherfuckers.
Took the cat. So we had that experience of being refugees with nothing but the clothes on our backs.
And so you arrive at the airport. You're allowed back in the car. You arrive back at the airport.
Yeah. So the car's gone.
Oh shit! They took the car.
Car's gone. Lucky that we got out ourselves. Car's gone. Walk to the embassy. Hang out there for a few days. Eventually, Marine helicopters come and take all the couple rounds of Americans out.
That's one hell of an experience for a 9-year-old.
It was. It was quite the experience. But again, I look back on it now and I look at everything that's happened in the world since and before. And again, I won the cosmic lottery. We were able to get out.
Yeah.
The Liberians that we worked with and became friends with and played with, and they weren't that lucky, right? Yeah. They had to stay and survive and then rebuild their country.
Wow. So that's God, what an experience.
Yeah. How
did that shape you?
Well, I went on and wanted to do international studies in college and, go work for an NGO and try and save the world. Instead, I went to law school.
Yeah, well,
But yeah, so that experience really primed me to understand the value as a Westerner, who has the reserve currency in my pocket, and who enjoys the rule of law and safety. To understand that the rest of the world doesn't have that. Most of the world doesn't have that. And any technology that allows you to escape with your life savings is something that we should fight for and promote.
Yeah, because there's a war now in Europe.
We're seeing it play out in Europe.
We're seeing it play out in Europe. There's not a lot of examples, but there are examples of people who explain that they've fled Ukraine with their private keys.
That's right.
With their Bitcoin. And we know how that's important. We know what important it is for human rights and for people who are in desperate situations. So I guess if you are working on the legislative side of this, you have come full circle.
Right. I suppose so. Yeah.
And so you discovered Bitcoin in the pandemic. You start listening to podcasts, and now you're on one.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Your podcast, Safety's podcast. Yeah.
Who the fuck?
So that was, that was an early experience.
Yeah.
And then I had a recent experience in my career, not as dramatic, but just as important to the client. I had a client who owned gold Kruger rands, which I guess are South African gold coins. And her father gave them to her. And she kept them in a safety deposit box, which she was the sole account holder of. Her husband, who was not an account holder, was hit with a judgment. Some business dealings went bad or something, and he owed money, and he was hit for a judgment. And so the creditor was trying to collect. And so they attached her box and said, you're married to him. We need to see what's in the box and to satisfy the judgment. His name was on the approved access list for the box, but was not an account holder. Under Florida law, the account holder, if the wife is an account holder and the husband's not, you don't get to then, attach the wife's accounts to satisfy the husband's judgments, unless they're joint accounts, but this was not a joint account. What happened was the judge did not appreciate the distinction of having access to the box versus being an account holder, and kind of flipped the presumptions around and made our client prove that the husband didn't put the coins into the box. And there was testimony from her brother that, they put in a certain amount. The judge disregarded the brother's testimony, found it incredible, and so said, yeah, the coins can be used to satisfy the husband's judgment. Take the wife's coins that were gifted to her by her late father. We appealed and lost on appeal as well.
Wow.
And that was a really, obviously frustrating for the client, because this.
Well, it's devastating.
Yeah. Not only is it just it's valuable property.
It's a gift from the father,
and it was a gift from her father.
Yeah.
And I think she ended up doing something where she has paid the value of it or something like that to keep them, but not right. So this client had her essentially her gold, which was secured in a safety deposit box with a custodian, taken, under color of law, essentially. And so that primed me to realize, well, if you have some property that now is not in a custodian's care, that is a bare asset that cannot be attached, cannot be taken, then you're in a lot better position than that client was.
So really, the fixed supply as a hedge against, the fixed supply which prevents against currency debasement, and then both the strong property rights of self-custody both stood out to you as based on your experience, both your childhood and your career. That's fascinating. Yeah,
and it's one of those things where it's frustrating that you have to have these lived experiences to understand the value as a Westerner. You had, what was that? The concern.tech letter where, the technologist said, oh, there's no value to it. And then, Gladstein and Zell got together and said, what are you talking about? Here's, 20 human rights activists and refugees who said it saved their lives. Yeah. How is that not valuable? Right.
But those people are people I don't find credible, because they're the types of people who've been posting and writing fight against Bitcoin for a long time. They've been told over and over again they're wrong. They've been given case studies and examples, and they choose to ignore it. They're people that come from a place of privilege who don't understand the different kind of economic challenges that people face in other parts of the world. One of the guys, I can't remember his name, but he lives up in Berkeley in San Francisco.
Right.
He lives a particularly privileged life, and he clearly hasn't spent the time to understand what it's like for somebody living in Argentina or Sri Lanka now, or any of these jurisdictions are suffering from either high inflation, or even China right now, where we've had people protesting outside bank accounts because they can't get their money.
Draw their money.
Or he's failed to look at what's happened in Cyprus when the banks essentially
the bail-in.
The bail-in, they took their money. So they're either willfully ignorant, or they are privileged, or I don't know what it is. There's a list of things, but they clearly are missing the empathetic part of the brain, where helps you understand that not everyone gets to live the same experience you have. I actually think the US has fairly strong property rights compared to some parts of the world.
It does.
And
it does.
I also think the US has a particularly fairly stable currency compared to other parts of the world. But you have to see these other parts of the world. You have to understand what other people have gone through. And for you to want to ban something that is actually a lifeboat and a tool that helps people in very difficult circumstances, honestly, I think they're some of the most despicable people alive. And I challenge them just sit down with somebody like Alex Gladstein, listen to these stories, get out of your own bubble, stop trying to legislate against other people, get out of your own bubble and understand what these people are going through. And if you're still against Bitcoin after you've heard these arguments, And honestly, I don't understand where you're coming from.
And I think you're right. I think that's what it comes down to, in my opinion, is there's some folks are maliciously, spreading lies, and others are just ignorant because, they just don't have to see it and they don't see it.
Well, they're selfish. I think some of these people are fundamentally selfish.
Yeah.
That could be. If you come from a point of privilege and you want to create controls over people who don't have that privilege, which makes their life harder and offers them less freedom, I think you're selfish. And fuck these people. All right, man. Well, listen, I want to find a little bit start with explaining the difference between the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, or how they work together. Just act like I'm some red coat who's run off with his tea, who's come back and he said, you know what can we learn from you? What happened after we sailed back to England?
All right. So I think what I'd like to try and do is challenge your perceptions of the Constitution. Maybe you already have these perceptions and understand this to be the way to view the Constitution, but I don't think most people do right now.
Shall I give you my two simple views of the Constitution?
Sure, please do.
My very first simple view is that I'm jealous we don't have a constitution in the UK. I know we have the Magna. Someone's going to comment on YouTube. We got the Magna Carta. We don't have something which people refer to. We don't have politicians standing up in Parliament saying, but in the Constitution, or this is unconstitutional. We don't have the press saying this is unconstitutional. We don't have lawyers saying it's unconstitutional. So I'm jealous that we don't have something there that we refer to that is a framework for the kind of freedoms that we want within our country. That's the second thing. The other simple view I have is, it seems to be hard to change. Seems to be, feels like some bits need to be updated. We're a few hundred years since the Constitution was written and established.
Yeah, and that's a valid viewpoint, and a lot of Americans share that viewpoint. Okay. Absolutely, and a lot of depending on how you interpret the Constitution, yes, I mean, that is a valid viewpoint. Now, there's certain ways of looking at the Constitution that give you more flexibility with the words, and that way of interpreting the Constitution has fallen out of vogue in the last probably 40 years in favor of strict textualism and original intent. What did it mean at the founding, and if it thus we can't have anything different now. That's not, I think people misunderstand what originalism really is. Originalism is, the text is fixed, the meaning was fixed at the founding, but that doesn't mean that meaning can't apply to new technologies and new societal situations. We just have to understand, what those words conveyed at the time, and then apply that meaning forward to new technologies. And you get examples like, Justice Gorsuch, one of the new justices, wrote a book, and then there were some excerpts in a magazine, going through some examples like cruel and unusual punishment, the Eighth Amendment. Obviously, lasers didn't exist at the time, but if you were going to, blast somebody with a laser, that would be cruel and unusual, right? It doesn't. You can adapt. You can adapt with the new technologies. Speech. We'll come back to this perhaps later in the talk. Speech can be code. It can be code. That's right. It can be something on the internet that the founders never even dreamed of. So, but going back to challenging of your view, there's 2 points. One is the Constitution is, leaving apart the Bill of Rights for now, the Constitution sets the framework for everything that the federal government can do. Meaning, if it's not in that document, the federal government doesn't have the power to do it. So it is powers that the people conferred on the federal government. You have to find, so the first question should always be, when a government takes any action, like, how are you able to do that? Show me in the Constitution government where it says you have the power to do that. Okay, so that's the first, way to view it. It's a list of permissions that the people have given the government, right? To check against tyranny, to make sure that the government is very constrained in what it can do. It's very much like cryptography. That's the analogy I like to use with cryptography now is cryptography gives you the ability to grant permissions to other people and protect your privacy, and thus constrain tyranny from the government or from big tech or whoever is spying on you at this moment. So the Constitution's like that. It's a list of permissions. The Bill of Rights is not the source of your human rights. The Bill of Rights is, again, another list of rights that the founders found important, but also a description of the ways in which the government is allowed to act vis-a-vis these rights, which are unalienable, inherent, fundamental, right? So there was a debate, and this will get into the difference between the Bill of Rights and the Constitution and a little bit of the history. There were two groups that were fighting over the Constitution once it had been hammered out in the convention. You had the Federalists, who were, strong central government, who were, approved of the Constitution as it was. And you had the Anti-Federalists, who wanted to keep things mostly the way they were, with the states being the primary governments, and kind of what we had going on was like a League of Nations type thing with the states. No real strong overseeing government. And one of the very valid anti-federalist arguments against the Constitution was there is no Bill of Rights in here. The Virginia had passed a Bill of Rights before the Declaration of Independence. It was, Thomas Jefferson used it kind of to draft the Declaration. And Massachusetts passed one like 1780. And so this was not an unknown phenomenon to list out, the rights that people have. The counter argument to that, which I also find very compelling, and we're kind of seeing the ramifications play out now today. The Federalists said, yes, but if we list out a bunch of rights, then that's going to be construed as the entire universe of rights that people have. And that's just not the case, right? We can't possibly list all of the freedoms that people have. And so we don't want to constrain ourselves that way through a document. And James Madison, who really, in my view, was kind of the father of the Constitution, he kind of mediated between these two sides. He wrote some of the Federalist Papers and was in favor of the Constitution. He had come to the conclusion that the previous document, the Articles of Confederation, was just inadequate and really pushed to get a new Constitution. But he also started out with the belief that we can't enumerate these rights, otherwise we will, lock ourselves into this list of rights forever. He came around because eventually they passed the Ninth Amendment and the 10th Amendment, which the Ninth Amendment says, the enumeration of these rights shall not be construed as limiting the rights that the people retain, essentially. And the 10th Amendment was similar, but as to the states, the powers not given to the federal government and not prohibited to the states, remain with the states and the people. So they put these amendments in to clarify, like, this is not the universe of your fundamental rights. This is not the source of your, inalienable and your, your human rights. And so that was how the anti-federalists ultimately came on board with the Constitution and agreed to ratify it amongst the state conventions. Is this Bill of Rights was included.
What came first, the Bill of Rights or the Constitution?
Constitution. So the Constitution was actually passed, and so there was a brief period of time where the Bill of Rights was not included, because the Bill of Rights is a set of amendments. So all 10 of the first amendments were passed as one package as the Bill of Rights a few years afterwards. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Okay. And so in terms of the work you do now, when do you refer to the Constitution and when do you refer to the Bill of Rights?
So the Constitution, if you're doing criminal law, you're doing which I do not do a whole lot of. You're referring almost exclusively to the Bill of Rights. You're also referring to certain sections of the Constitution that guarantee the right to jury trial and things like that, which are not part of the Bill of Rights. They're in the main bulk of the Constitution. If you're talking about anything related to, if you're out of the criminal context and then you're talking about litigating against the government or litigating, what the government can and can't do in terms of legislation, or that's usually going to be the main bulk, the original Constitution. But not necessarily. To give you the lawyer answer, it depends.
It depends on the scenario.
Yeah.
Okay. So sometimes you refer to one, sometimes to both, sometimes the other.
That's right.
And it's all case dependent. And is a lot of the interpretation of the Constitution comes down to the precedents that have been set with specific litigation.
Yeah, that's correct. And so you have kind of this body of common law precedent that builds up over time. They kind of locks in one interpretation or another. And then you have big kind of epochal changes in that, like we've just seen with Roe versus Wade being overturned.
Yeah.
But there are other examples in history too, where there's just big epochal changes.
But the big epochal change that we've just seen now seems a very political change, but has it always been that way? Is it,
I'm a little cynical, and I'm of the belief it's always been.
It's always been political.
I think our view in the States of the Supreme Court as a, ultimate arbiter of legal truth that stands above the political fray is almost something that kind of came about, in the civil rights era, the 60s, the 70s. And maybe it existed in the past before, but there's always been gamesmanship. There's always been politics involved. I mean, I'll give you a good example that's relevant to money and Bitcoin. The biggest case of the 20th century, if you just go by, press coverage, was actually in the 30s, and it had to do with the federal government's attack on gold. And you don't learn about this case in law school, and you don't learn about it in American history.
Is that the
gold
Executive Order 2106?
So it was related to that whole package that FDR was essentially that whole policy he was pursuing. And the federal government passed laws saying, any contract that has a gold clause in it, which was a clause that said, if you owe me X amount of dollars, I want it repaid, and I have the option to get repaid in gold, the gold equivalent of whatever it was at the time. And it was an inflation hedge, right? And it was, these were clauses that existed since, they always existed, but they really came into being after the Civil War, when you had, you had this big fight over paper money. The Civil War, the Union government, the federal government printed greenbacks to fund the war, and then they were declared legal tender. And states like California, who had a lot of gold because of the gold rush and had a very strong, gold-based economy, the merchants all got together and lobbied the government and were able to put these clauses in that said, we're accepting gold, and gold, we're not going to be bound to accept paper money. If it says gold, that's what it is, that I shall be paid in gold. And then they passed legislation that said, yes, if two parties agree to be paid in a type of money, the repayment has to be in that type of money. We're not going to call it satisfied, the judgment satisfied, if you use greenbacks. It's got to be in the money that was contracted for. So these gold clauses existed for a long time. And then it came to a head when FDR was confiscating everyone's gold and then, trying to push through his economic reforms. And so like the federal government had gold clauses in their bonds. And also there were private, these private ones. And so the government passed a law just saying like, those are invalid. Like gold clauses are invalid. You gotta pay up in paper money. You gotta accept paper money in discharge. So, all the creditors took a haircut, right? All the debtors, of course, were very happy. But these cases were like really, really big. Everyone was talking about them to the point where, and it was very, very rancorous. And this was also at a time when the Supreme Court had been, thumbing its nose at the presidency and just striking down all of FDR's New Deal plans. And it was very close to this time when he started being very aggressive in response and threatened to increase the number of justices on the court and pack the court packing scheme and all of this. But what happened with these Gold Clause cases is he had a speech written, a radio address, ready for when the Gold Clauses would have been upheld, when they thought maybe the Supreme Court was going to uphold these Gold Clauses against, and rule against the president and Congress. So he had this speech drafted and it leaked. And it basically said, I'm going to ignore the Supreme Court, and we're moving forward with our legislation. And that has been seen by some scholars as, this point where there was a ton of political pressure against the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court bent to that pressure and ruled in favor of the president and the administration and invalidated the Gold Clauses.
Do you think that was also because it was a time of pressure, economic pressure?
Oh, for sure.
Like a desperate situation.
No, but it just goes to show you that in the face of strong political, fighting, because scholars, you can read law review articles that discuss the actual reasoning of these cases, and they're a little strained.
But the Constitution doesn't refer to money, right? But the Bill of Rights does.
So we can get into this too. Going back to, the federal government can only do what it's granted the power to do.
Yeah.
You wouldn't know that the federal government doesn't have the express power to print fiat money and declare legal tender.
Right. Okay.
That's not a power that was granted to the federal government, and that was a conscious decision by the founders.
Right.
And
we know that because it was discussed, debated?
Yes, exactly. So we have, going back to James Madison, he took really detailed, shorthand notes of the debates at the Constitutional Convention. And the question was, do we give the federal government that power? Do we not give the federal government that power to print money and declare legal tender? And the founders didn't agree on everything. They were not a monolith, but they did pretty much all universally agree that fiat paper sucked. And they all hated it. And some of the languages that's recorded is very strong, evils of paper money, and we're going to crush paper money with this Constitution. So they really wanted to eliminate fiat and legal tender laws, because there was a history in the colonial era of states just printing money and state money hyperinflating, with all the economic ills that go along with that. Not every state. Some states were pretty disciplined, but Rhode Island and Massachusetts were pretty bad about hyperinflating.
Right. Okay.
So there was this long.
They knew there was a risk, and that was the point, wasn't it? They were aware of the risks.
They were aware of the risks, very well aware of it.
Yeah.
And the previous document, the Articles of Confederation, also didn't constrain that type of printing, so the states continued to print their own money. And so, right, they consciously decided not to grant that power to the federal government. Subsequent to that, however, we had the legal tender cases post-Civil War, where that power was kind of inferred through all of the monetary clauses, and then through another clause called the necessary and proper clause, which is kind of like a catch-all clause. It's supposed to be interpreted narrowly, but was interpreted very broadly. And again, at a time of, this was post-Civil War. Economy was, trying to reintegrate the states, and there was all this, union money that had been printed, and the Supreme Court needed to say yes, that's lawful money, and the federal government had the power to declare that legal tender, but that's not in the Constitution.
Right.
So that's an area where monetary reality and economic reality kind of trumps what's in the actual Constitution. So there's, the federal government can basically coin money, specie, gold and silver. Yeah. They can coin money, they can borrow money, they can tax, but legal tender is not a power that the federal government was granted.
at the time.
At the time.
But here we are.
That's right.
With a very unusual situation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what is the legal tender status of the dollar right now? Is it legal tender as set by the federal government, or is it legal tender that, or do states have the option to create legal tender at the moment? Explain that whole piece.
Right. So yes, the U.S. dollar is now official legal tender, and it's what it says on all of your banknotes, your bills. The states, if you go to Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, it has a list of. I also have it printed here, so it's a little bit more.
Oh, fantastic!
There you go. There's a list of prohibitions on things the states can't do.
No state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters or mark and reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts.
Exactly.
That's the important bit.
That's the important bit.
Okay, explain that.
Mm-hmm. Right. So this is going back to the founders really wanted to prevent paper money, and states were the chief offenders when it came to paper money. So they wanted to stop. They wanted to prevent the states from having any power to essentially engage in an inflationary monetary policy, and to do that, they passed this. They put this provision into the Constitution that says you can't make anything, which is very broad, but silver and gold coin a tender in payments.
But that's for the states.
For the states.
That's why we don't have a New York dollar or a California dollar.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And you can understand why. That would be beneficial to have a uniform, economy.
Of course.
Right. But the states were always allowed to have gold and silver, as tender, and going back to California, that's what people used.
So
for a long time.
Is gold and silver legal tender in every state now?
Not every state,
but it is in some.
I think Wyoming, it is. It might still be in California, but I'm pretty sure Wyoming it is.
So in Wyoming, if you want to, you can use gold coin to pay for things.
I think so.
And what additional status does that grant that coin as money, being legal tender?
Right. And this is where I think a lot of Bitcoiners get confused. Legal tender is actually a really kind of simple concept. It does not confer tax exempt status on transactions used with that money, which is a common misconception. All it is it's money that must be accepted by a creditor in discharge of a debt.
Okay, so it must be accepted.
Yes.
So therefore in Wyoming, you must accept it.
Right.
And when you say in discharge of a debt...
Pre-existing debt.
Pre-existing
debt. That is to distinguish it from spot transactions, like I'm going to go
into
down
a
to
gas station.
Yeah, the Ventanita to get, our Cuban coffee.
Right.
That would be a spot transaction where it does not have to be accepted.
Give me an example of a debt settlement where it has to be accepted.
Paying your mortgage.
Okay, right. So if I get a mortgage with, I don't know, Chase in Wyoming, they have to, if I want to pay that mortgage in gold, they have to accept it.
Yeah.
That's fucking cool.
I think don't, again, I'm not an expert on Wyoming's laws, but I think I saw that Wyoming is like one of the only states that actually, has a provision for gold as legal tender.
I might call up Tyler Lindholm and say,
that's exactly who you should talk to, actually.
He'd
be the expert.
Are you paying your mortgage in gold coin, Tyler? Let me know.
Because that's what in El Salvador with Bitcoin now is legal tender. That was some of the trepidation and anxiety from the financial sector is like, oh crap, how do we now accept this crazy internet money, for people who want to pay their mortgages and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So that's all. That's what legal tender is. It's not, and then going back to El Salvador, staying on that, you've got kind of this forced tender concept, right? Where even in spot transactions, someone has to accept it.
Yeah. So that's a different scenario.
That's a different scenario. And those did exist in the colonies, and were enforced. And that was also part of the reason the founders didn't like legal tender laws is, the compulsory aspects of them. But for the most part, when we talk about a legal tender law, we just mean, satisfies the discharge of a debt.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So when you start thinking about Bitcoin, and you've referred, and earlier in the interview you said these when the Constitution was established, that obviously technology and things change over time. So there's a chance you could interpret this that, as it says here, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. I think you potentially making the argument that if Bitcoin had existed, it may have been considered here as something that could be. Right.
Yes, that's the argument I made. I wrote a series of articles for my newsletter going through, basically what happened was there's this huge push for, Bitcoin to be adopted as legal tender, right? And everybody's clamoring for that. But even at the state level here in the States, and nobody's talking about Article 1, Section 10. Like, not even opponents are really raising it. So I was like, why are we just ignoring this purposefully? Like, what? Let's address this. So nobody had made any arguments one way or the other. So I said, well, I'll just make all the arguments. Okay. So I made an argument based on an originalist interpretation of this section, that Bitcoin should be considered essentially a gold or silver coin, that the founders would have approved of Bitcoin based on its similarities with those commodity monies.
In that there's no central party that controls it. There's a scarce aspect.
Scarcity, unforgeably costly. All those aspects of Bitcoin that we prize were apparent in gold and silver, and obviously Bitcoin elevates that, right, with a global monetary network. I also made the counter argument, the strict textualist counter argument, that this is a very specific clause. You shall not make anything. That's a very broad term, anything but gold and silver coin. And that's a specific term. So you've got a prohibition that's very broad, can't make anything legal tender. And that would then, if you apply that to new technologies, right, because it's a broad term, broad original understanding, that would eliminate Bitcoin because it doesn't fall under the exception, which is very specific, of a silver or gold coin. I presented that counter argument as well. And then I have kind of a follow-up policy argument that I don't think that this is good policy, even if it is constitutional, to adopt Bitcoin as state legal tender. And so we can walk through all those if you want.
Yeah, please do.
So the argument for how Bitcoin could be considered, legal tender under this clause is going back to what we were talking about with the founders and their intent of, eliminating inflationary monetary policies based on their experience, the colonial experience, and the debates and their writings after the debates and during the debates. We know that, they basically had three objectives by limiting the states to gold and silver coin. They wanted to eliminate that inflationary monetary policy. They wanted to stop currency and trade wars amongst the states, because what some states were doing, like Rhode Island, was they were printing a ton of money, and then Massachusetts had to accept it, and they were spending it in Massachusetts before the prices would rise, right? So then they were exporting their inflation to the other states, and then there was tit for tat. After that, it was like a state-level Cantillon effect.
That's
right?
like the Monopoly Board argument. Did you listen to my recent interview with Preston Pysh?
No, I didn't catch it.
So he was talking about trying to explain inflation.
Right.
And he was saying there's two games of Monopoly that happen at the same time. But there's one new rule in that you can buy properties from the other board. So you can own property on the other board. And so what might happen is that the players at one table might collude and say, you know what, when we pass go, we're not going to give you $200. We're going to give you $600. And obviously your wealth increases and you've got more money than the other game. So then you can look at the other board and go, I'm going to start buying some of that property. And because things are becoming scarcer, the people around that table are like, what the fuck's going on here? Like, they're acquiring our property. And, we're feeling poorer. So they might collude and go, do you know what, when we pass go, we'll grant ourselves $1,000.
Exactly.
And they start buying back. And then you just have this tit for tat.
That's exactly what played out amongst the colonies.
Right.
Yeah. And that's exactly what the founders wanted to stop by preventing the states from being in control of the money supply.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So that was the second reason. And then the third was,
which you can't do with gold and silver.
Which you can't. Right. You can't print more gold and silver. Exactly. You can't.
Yeah. So that's what they were trying to prevent.
Right. And then the third thing that the founders were trying to prevent was foreign entanglements, pissing off foreign countries who want to do business in the States, and now they got to transact in 50 different. Well, at the time it was 13 different currencies.
Right.
And keeping foreign affairs within the realm of the federal government. So if you look at those purposes, right, gold and silver were the best money to solve those problems, right? Because like we were saying, you can't dig more gold out of the ground much faster. Certainly not then. So you had this concept of hard commodity monies. That's what gold and silver were. That's the original understanding of this. This is the only thing that fit that description, right? That solved all these ills at the time. You couldn't use tobacco, right? Because tobacco is not unforgeably costly. You can grow a lot more of it, and then it depletes. You use it; it's perishable.
Yeah.
And this is what like states did, right? They had commodity monies that were not gold and silver. They had tobacco notes. They actually had notes that were good for like a bale of tobacco back at the warehouse.
Huh.
Yeah, before independence. This is kind of how they got around not having specie, because they're on the other side of the world and nobody wanted to send their money over there, so they had to get creative. So commodity monies were what the colonists were using and what the early Americans were using, and gold and silver was the hardest commodity money. So now that's the original understanding. Now we have technological developments, we have synthetic commodity monies, right? This is what George Selgin describes Bitcoin as. And that is, Bitcoin is inscribing this hard money, monetary policy. It is the hardest. I mean, it's the hardest money we have now, right? I mean, the inflation. Besides, it's right on par with gold, inflation level wise, and it'll decrease past gold very shortly. And have the lowest inflation rate. So, if you look also at Satoshi's writings, right? And
his Federalist Papers.
That's his Federalist Papers. That's right. Some of the early, Bitcoin talk forums.
Yeah.
He describes it with, analogies to gold. Right.
Yeah.
That post about, imagine a, colorless, gray, metal that was, hard to produce, but people wanted it because you could send it wherever you wanted it to go. Right. Mm-hmm. And some of the early forerunners to gold, like Szabo's BitGold, they're all referring to gold. This is Satoshi's describing the mining process and analogizing it to gold. So now we have digital gold, we have Bitcoin, and it's just an extension of this commodity money concept that was the original meaning here in Article 1, Section 10.
So the interesting part of this is that even if the states can make gold and silver legal tender, because of technology and the way money works now, and it is essentially digital, it's kind of painful. It's kind of annoying. If a bank accepts gold, then they have to take custody of it, and then they have to sell it. And it's a painful thing.
Exactly.
It's kind of annoying. I can see why they wouldn't. But actually, they are a check and balance against the money printing. They reduce the power of the state, of the federal government. But Bitcoin's a different scenario. Bitcoin, because it's still digital and the way exchanges work, if a bank was to accept it, like they have to in El Salvador,
right,
there's an instant liquid market where they can come out of it and then hold the dollar. So if it was to be made legal tender, that would essentially achieve what I think the founding fathers would have wanted to, which is reduce the impact or the inflationary pressure that comes from printed money.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the argument for it to be included here is quite strong.
It is, yes, it is. I think it's fairly strong until you get to, a strict textualist analysis.
Anything.
And so the textualists say, original intent is fixed meaning to new technology, sure, but only when you have, a broad language that's capable of encompassing that new technology. And so if you apply that here, going back to what I was saying, anything is the prohibition, right? That's the broad language. So you apply anything to any new technological money that comes along, because that's broad. And again, going back to commodity monies in the colonies, there were tons of different commodity monies, and tons of different monetary devices. So they knew that gold and silver wasn't the only thing, and that there would probably be some new way to a different commodity that you're going to new paper bills that come about, some new technology or scheme that would come about as money. So they that's the argument there. If you're looking at anything as being broad language that encompasses anything subsequent to the founding.
But the interesting part of this for me is that one of the things I romanticize about the founding fathers, which I know once you get into it, you learn about the different flaws of the different characters, what they would argue about, yada, yada. But there was this, for me, it felt like there was this general integrity that existed to restrict the power of the federal government to avoid tyranny, because you experienced that as people under our British king. Was it even referred to as the British king back then, or were we referred to the English king?
I think you were still Britons. Yeah.
Were we Britons?
I think it was British. The British Empire.
Yeah, British Empire. But ever since then, there's been obvious scope creep of what the federal government does, and there seems to be a lack of integrity since for those politicians, not all, but a lot of politicians, not to carry out their duties with the same integrity of protecting the constituents from a overreaching government. And for me, it would feel like any interpretation of this, when it's to be debated or discussed, the starting point, it should be, should we interpret this in a way, or are we interpreting this in a way which does reduce that power? Are we able to achieve what the founding fathers wanted to achieve with this? So you can be literal and prevent Bitcoin, or you can be more pragmatic and understand that the introduction of Bitcoin into this does further what the founding fathers wanted to achieve.
Right. And you're exactly right that, there's a risk when you're talking about strict textualism that you become hyper literal.
Yeah.
And,
and tyrannical.
Yes. And in fact, if you look at the definitions, the contemporary definitions of gold at the founding, yes, it was a metallic substance, but it also was just defined as just money, right? So the meaning of gold in this clause is they're just referring to money, right? And we know a hard commodity money, but anything that's money. So you can find contemporary textual examples that do support a broader interpretation of gold and silver, and even broader interpretations of coin, right? Because that's another limiting word there, that it's got to be a gold and silver coin. But coins, coin was used like we use coin today very broadly. I'm going to coin a phrase. I'm going to coin paper money is how they used it. Benjamin Franklin talked about coining land in a land bank, almost like tokenizing assets like we think about today with digital assets.
And this is quite interesting because this helps me understand a little bit more now around the debate regarding the Second Amendment, which has been debated a lot recently with the very tragic cases. I don't have a copy of the Second Amendment in front of me, but it discusses a well-armed...
Well, you do, but I'm not going to make you
but it's a well-armed militia. And obviously those who interpret it literal will say, well, these aren't militias now.
Right.
But those who interpret it forget the language you use, but they would say that it allows for any person to hold a weapon.
Right. And in the Second Amendment too, some of the debate is over that, a well-regulated militia is kind of a prefatory clause. And then you get into what is this really defining the rest of it, or is this just kind of an introductory clause? Like, yes, a well-regulated militia is important. The right of, to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
Yeah.
Right. It's almost like they're two separate thoughts. At least that's what the Supreme Court has said, is that they're two separate. There is a comma.
There is a comma. So they are two separate thoughts. Yeah. But I can see that's how then the interpretation comes. And then, okay, so back to the work you're doing. This is at a time now where we are seeing debates from state to state regarding Bitcoin. Some states are very pro-Bitcoin. Texas is pretty pro-Bitcoin. Wyoming's pretty pro-Bitcoin. Even here in Florida, it's fairly pro-Bitcoin. And then we're seeing states which have a slightly different approach, which maybe New York, you would say, is a little bit more cynical regarding Bitcoin. And this is the cool thing about living in a republic, is that you get to vote with your feet. Right. States compete, and you can go where the laws are that you prefer, which is great. But therefore, there are people proposing in certain states that Bitcoin becomes legal tender. I see Dennis Porter talking about this relentlessly.
Right. Yeah. Arizona had a proposal that was just straight up Bitcoin is legal tender.
Okay.
The definition of Bitcoin is very simplistic and probably wouldn't work, but yeah.
But what that is a proposed bill.
Yeah.
What is the actual process that has to go through to be ratified, say in Arizona?
Right. So if Arizona were to pass that bill, so the legislature would pass it, and then the governor would sign it into law, and it would just be the law of the land until someone challenged it.
Right.
And the way that would come up in that instance is somebody would try to discharge their debt with Bitcoin, and then the creditor would refuse to accept, and then the debtor would have to sue, and then you'd go along from there all the way up it'd be in state court at first, and then you'd have arguments that it violates Article 1, Section 10, and all the way up to wherever.
And when it ends at the Supreme Court, then you have the precedent that sets it. Interesting.
Yeah.
So are you doing this work to help guide people, or like, why are you doing this?
Right. Exactly. So that is the question. Why am I doing this? Again, it is to help guide people and to help guide the policy. To help people think about things a little more critically, and to put these arguments out there so that these arguments exist. And so if there's ever a court case, it's kind of like open sourcing these arguments, right?
I get it.
I want people to join in and provide some counter arguments and poke holes, and let's really vet this, because good policy should come out of that open discussion. Hopefully before we get to a big case where we're arguing over constitutionality of legal tender. The Arizona bill is not going to get. That was just kind of a political stunt, right? That's not really going anywhere.
That's a hack.
Yeah.
Get some Bitcoiners to follow me.
It is a hack. It's the Bitcoin hack.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We know it exists because we get approached by nearly every single one who wants to come on the show. They're going to get followers. But fine. Like, in some ways, maybe that's the way it should be. If that hack exists and it works, it's because it's the will of the people to want it.
So now, and I want to go in and say, I've made this argument that I think is pretty strong, that, the original intent of this section should include Bitcoin. I personally don't like the idea of legal tender.
So that was like my final. We were going to start with this, and then me and Danny agreed this should be the final question, because we met up last night. We went out for tacos. And Mexican and a couple of beers, and you said, I don't think Bitcoin should be legal tender.
Right. And so this is because, going back to that definition of legal tender, it only applies to pre-existing debts. But what it's doing is it's impairing those debts. It's impairing that private contract between two, consenting individuals. That freedom of contract has been eliminated, because now, as the creditor, I have to accept Bitcoin. And that's not what I agreed to.
And legal tender always has to retrospectively apply to legal. Yeah. You couldn't have it for all contracts post ratification.
I mean, you could put that proviso in the law. I mean, sure, but
you still don't think it should be legal tender.
Because yes, I mean, I would be more in favor of something like that, where it said we're going to apply this prospectively. Yeah. But the other thing that legal tender laws do, right, is they favor one money over the others, right, and it eliminates that kind of free, economic process, that happens when you have new commodities, new goods that come onto the market, and that natural monetization process. We're all Bitcoiners, but I think we want the best money to win.
Yes.
Right. And right now that's Bitcoin. But it might not always be Bitcoin.
And is there another risk that if Bitcoin did become legal tender, there would be an argument for shitcoin A, shitcoin B to be legal tender?
Oh yeah, that's definitely a risk. But I think the more important thing to consider, yeah, I mean, that's a risk. But again, it comes back to, I think we all want freedom, right? That's why Bitcoin exists, is to be apolitical freedom money separate from the state. Uh-huh. And when you start to then advocate for the state to come and be involved in your freedom money, it's, I hate the phrase slippery slope, but it starts to be a slippery slope, because first it starts as legal tender, and then it moves to compulsory tender. Everyone has to accept it for all transactions.
Which was one of the big criticisms with El Salvador.
That's right. And then it moves to, well, maybe if everyone's got to accept it, then maybe the governments just start, fixing the price, which never works with any money, right? But and especially won't work with Bitcoin, but causes a lot of headaches for everyone. So that's the danger of, and again, if this is we're supposed to be separating the state from money, just like the founders wanted to do, is to keep the state out of the money, to keep our freedoms and our liberties intact. And that's what Satoshi wanted to do. And that was the cypherpunk movement, was to keep our liberties intact by, granting the government limited permissions where possible. So I find it a little hypocritical of some Bitcoiners who are actively, look, if they're in Bitcoin for their bags, right, and they know that states accepting it as legal tender is going to increase the price and they're going to profit, like, that's fine. You do you, but like, don't then say you're in it for freedom and human rights, because those things are starting to be in conflict.
Well, or maybe they didn't understand it to the extent that you've explained it just now. Because
maybe.
Okay, let's go back 24 hours. Somebody said to me, Arizona, Texas, Wyoming are all going to make Bitcoin legal tender. I'm not thinking about my bags. I'm just thinking, wow, that gives us extra regulatory protection because it's now legal tender.
Right.
It advances the opportunity for more people to consider and own Bitcoin to escape the fiat system. To me, it kind of in some ways feels like it provides more freedom. It's only by having this hour plus I've had with you now that I now understand it actually reduces your freedom.
Well, and you're correct that it absolutely would bring those beneficial aspects of shining a light on Bitcoin and getting everyone aware of it.
But it reduces your freedom.
It does. It's going to reduce your freedoms. And look, people are going to say, well, it's inevitable. Like, governments are going to do this anyways, and yeah, they probably will, but like, let's not invite the government in now when we still have time to, strengthen Bitcoin against attacks, be they governmental or otherwise. The other thing is there are alternative policies that achieve those same, beneficial results.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
What legal protections would you like to see?
Mm-hmm. Right. And you're starting to see them, right? Gillibrand and Lummis's crypto digital asset law, which is going to provide a tax exemption on transactions under $600. That's great. I think that's what a lot of people want.
Which rises with inflation. Which rises with inflation. Really smart clause.
It is. It's a really smart clause, and I hope it stays in. And I hope I would be in favor of a larger initial transaction limit, but $600 is great. I just hope it doesn't get batted down, when it comes to the backdoor fights with Treasury and everyone else.
But that's a federal bill.
Yeah, that's a federal bill. It's not something that states can do. States, I'd like to see Bitcoin clauses like the gold clauses we were talking about in contracts. And then I'd like to see states passing bills that say, any money you want that you contract for, like that's what the judgment has to be satisfied in. Because otherwise you get a situation where we contract in Bitcoin and there's no USD denomination whatsoever in our contract. One Bitcoin is one Bitcoin. And then, we get into a dispute, you win a judgment against me, because I didn't pay you the Bitcoin. But because USD is legal tender, the government says, well, it's, one Bitcoin is equal to $19,000. So here's your $19,000. But you don't want the $19,000. You want the Bitcoin, right? So unless you have those laws that are saying we're going to respect freedom of contract and, whatever money is chosen by the consenting parties, it's you can put all the clauses you want in your contract, but if you have to enforce them, they're not going to be enforced the way you want. So that's something the states can do, and that is a general purpose law that would encompass all altcoins, encompass anything, encompass tobacco notes maybe.
Is there a group of Bitcoin interested lawyers who are actively getting together and discussing these things? Do you have a cohort that you are working with on these discussions? Because I think, like I've said, I think some people pushing towards having legal tender perhaps don't understand the implications of it. A bit like you have the Bitcoin Policy Institute working on educating within the Congress, hopefully. Do you have a cohort where you're out there actually trying to help people who are pushing for changes to legislation?
So it's interesting talking about a cohort of Bitcoin lawyers. There aren't too many there's tons of digital asset lawyers who are very smart and very good at what they do.
Well, they're going to be busy helping people with the SEC.
Exactly. And there are groups of those that are, kind of more in like the DAO space.
Yeah.
And there's, DAOs of lawyers who get together. But it's not Bitcoin focused. There aren't too many lawyers who are Bitcoin focused.
But there might be some who are interested, like yourself. And
sure.
I just think if that cohort existed, then you could be having those discussions, debates about the implications of some of the things people are doing. And then you could help educate via my show or via a Twitter space or when Dennis Porter is pushing something.
So what I'm actively exploring now is putting together a kind of an amicus program or a judicial education program. And I've been in talks with some policy groups. Nothing's settled yet, so I'm not gonna say anything about it. But this is what I'm exploring doing, and educating the policy makers and those who are advocating for policy, but also the judiciary, because the groups like Bitcoin Policy Institute and the Bitcoin Today Coalition, they're focused on talking to lawmakers and talking to the agency, enforcement arms, but they're not talking to the judiciary yet. And so what you've got the lawmakers who are going to make the law are being educated on Bitcoin. You've got the agencies who are going to enforce the laws being educated on Bitcoin. But then the judiciary who's going to review that enforcement are not being educated on Bitcoin. And so, I kind of like to think of those three, it's the separation of powers. You have the Congress, the agencies are in the executive and the judiciary. It's kind of like Bitcoin, right? The lawmakers are kind of like the devs.
Yeah.
Right? They write the code, they write the law, and then the miners are kind of like the agencies. They enforce, they run the code, they enforce the protocol. But then you've also got validator nodes who check the work of the enforcement prong, and that's the judiciary.
Interesting.
And we haven't had much outreach to the judiciary yet. So that's what I'm exploring doing is helping either through, appearing in cases on behalf of interested policy groups to file amicus briefs. Coin Center does this work.
Yeah.
And they're super smart guys over there, and they've been doing it a hell of a lot longer than I have. But they're a large tent, and they're not focused expressly on Bitcoin. So to get a group together that would, be interested in doing that, that's one of the things I'm exploring now.
That's quite interesting, that separation of powers within Bitcoin that you've identified, and how that works. That's I think I've heard that before. Maybe I have.
I'm sure I'm not the first person to mention that.
But it's quite interesting.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting, like the rules of consensus are a bit like the Constitution.
Right.
There's like a real, it's almost like Satoshi.
It's almost like it's intentional, right?
Yeah, it's almost like it's intentional. It's almost like he looked upon the separation of powers and the Constitution, and that's part of the framework he used to build Bitcoin. That's fascinating. Is there anything in this I've not asked you about that we've missed?
I mean, I could go on all day. I don't know. I don't know what else you want to talk about. So, one of the other things I'm exploring is this. You were talking about some states being anti, or hostile to Bitcoin. New York passed their moratorium on proof of work, which hasn't been signed by the governor yet. And so I'm exploring. I wrote another article on that and how the moratorium would be a violation of the First Amendment, freedom of speech. So I'm exploring a test case related to that.
I think we're going to save that for another show.
Yeah,
because I think that's okay. We did discuss that
a lot
before.
To talk about there.
So we had it here, and we're like, look, we want our shows to be between an hour and an hour and a half. We think that's a sweet spot. And we're like, if we run in about 45 minutes, then we'll go into that. But we've got to come back to Miami soon, and I think that would make for a second fascinating show.
And maybe I'll have a lot more concrete to discuss about that in the next show.
So some people listening won't know you, won't have heard of you, but might be interested in getting in touch, wanting to talk to you, and engage with you. How do they find you?
So you can find all of my articles on bitcoinbrief.io. That's my newsletter. I've also published a couple articles in Bitcoin Magazine. You can just search for Aaron Daniel on Bitcoin Magazine. Shoot me an email at aaron@bitcoinbrief.io, and then my Twitter is @WADaniel. So that's where you can find me. You can also just search me on the Florida Bar website. Call my office.
We'll shove that all in the show notes. Look, I'm really glad we got to do this. This was fascinating.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. This has been a great discussion.
We had to. We stopped by we stopped by a hurricane before, or a tornado?
Yeah, it was a tropical storm. I was going to meet you in Nashville.
Yeah,
and the first storm of the season blew through, and I was telling Danny, one of my friends' neighborhoods was like completely flooded.
Oh, shit.
Yeah, his house was okay, but yeah, it was a little dicey there. We've been okay thus far.
Well, I'm glad we got
season
to do
hasn't
this.
Kicked up too bad yet.
Yeah, I'm glad we got to do this, and we will do it again because we've already realized we've got to come back to Miami pretty soon. So
you always got to come back to Miami.
Always got to come back to Miami. But yeah, look, really appreciate you coming on, man. This is fascinating. It's really interesting to hear, and anything we can do to help you, stay in touch, and good luck with this.
I appreciate it. Thanks.
I think people are gonna want to talk to you. So
I welcome all criticism and discussion. Please seek me out.
All right, man. Well, listen, good luck with this.
All right. Thanks. Appreciate it.